Thank you, Mark, and thank you all for coming. As Mark already pointed out, I'm presenting today the key trends, but also the main challenges that we found for investment in human resources in agriculture R&D in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is based on primary data collection we did over the past 3 years. I will end my presentation with a number of key areas for policy implications that need to be addressed. Will African agriculture R&D overcome these funding and capacity challenges that I will briefly touch on? So why is agriculture R&D important? As IFPRI, but also many other studies, many other organizations have conducted research on the rate of returns, the impact of R&D on economic growth and poverty reduction, and this impact is very high. So it pays off to invest in R&D for countries to develop their agricultural sector, but also to develop their economies. Africa is facing many important challenges: rapid population growth, climate change, water scarcity, volatile food prices. And for countries to address these various challenges, there is more support. There is currently more support for agricultural development, but again, this also needs an increased attention to agricultural R&D. In order to monitor and benchmark the inputs and outputs, as well as the performance of agricultural research systems, quantitative data is essential. And this is important for policy formulation, not only at the national level, but also for agriculture R&D agencies themselves and the systems themselves. So that's where ASTI comes in. We provide quantitative data on the inputs that are going into agriculture research at the national level. Furthermore, the African Ministerial Council on Science and Technology, which is also through the NEPAD, the African program, adopted a consolidated plan of action. And this plan calls for an increasing national R&D budget so that countries allocate at least 1% of their GDP to research and development. I have my presentation as usual. If you work with data, they have a lot of figures. All these figures except one, they are in the report, so you may not be able to see everything, all the details of the figures, but you can see them in the report. And also some of the country facts that I cite here and there, they're from the country notes, and they're also, all of them are on the USB stick, except 2 or 3 that haven't not been finalized yet. So what we found is that after a period of a declining investment, which is the green line, agricultural research investments in Africa as a region, as a whole, increased by more than 20% between 2000 and 2008. The total number of researchers also increased at a similar rate. And we found that part of this increase actually happened at the higher education sector. The share of higher education in total agricultural research staff in Africa increased from 15% in 1991 to 24% in 2008. I'm presenting here, and the rest of my presentation, the trends in the public sector, and this means that we exclude the private sector in our data analysis. We have some data for the private sector, but it's increasingly difficult to get information. But we also found that in many of the African countries, the role of the private sector is still small, and is, although in some countries it is increasing, it's still a minor player in agricultural research. This overall growth is positive, however, it hides significant cross-country differences. So what we actually found, that the main drivers of spending growth is only a handful of countries. 1/3 of the spending growth between 2001 and 2008 was driven by just one country, which is Nigeria, which is of course the largest country in sub-Saharan Africa. And other important countries were Ghana, Tanzania, Uganda, and Sudan. And we found that these increases is partly also what I already mentioned, to higher education, but also it was increased of funding by the government. And this was mostly to boost low salaries and rehabilitate infrastructure and equipment after years of neglect, and not that much for to support actual research programs. However, we found that in the remaining countries, agricultural research spending has stagnated or have fallen since the turn of the millennium. Actually, spending in 13 countries included in our survey actually declined since 2000. And this, it's a little bit hard to see these countries, but you can see the figure in the report. This spending decline was particularly hard strong in Francophone West Africa. And this was the reason was the completion of various large donor-funded projects. So that was a short overview of our main trends. We have collected a lot of in-depth data on this, to say that the determinants of the funding and the human capacities increases and decreases. And we identified a number of challenges. First, one of the investment challenges is underinvestment. We found that in Africa, on average, Africa invested an average of 61 cents for every $100 of agricultural output. But you see again from this graph that there's a wide variation, but there were only 8 countries of the 31 for which we had spending data that actually spent more than 1% of their GDP on agricultural research. Striking in this figure are, of course, Botswana, but also some of the other countries, which are small countries which have small agricultural sectors. But also Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, some of the larger countries are investing more than 1%. I mentioned Nigeria earlier, who accounted for 1/3 of the spending growth, absolute spending growth. But Nigeria still invests 0.4% of agricultural GDP in agricultural research. And some of the countries have, at the moment, such low levels of investments that the impact of agricultural research on rural development and poverty reduction is questionable at the best. Another issue we found that many countries, the agricultural research systems continue to be highly dependent on donor funding and also development bank loans. And donor funding is short-term and ad hoc. And in this graph, you can see that the main agencies of Guinea, Madagascar, Eritrea, Mozambique, and Mali accounted for more than half of their total funding in 2008 came from donors and development bank loans. We also find, of course, because of the ad hoc nature of donor funding, funding for agricultural research has been highly volatile. An example here is on the right side for you, Niger. Agricultural research investment declined substantially after a World Bank project ended. But also Zambia had large fluctuation in not only on donor funding, but also on government allocations to agricultural research. And for example, Niger has an intensity ratio of 0.2%. So they invest 0.2% of their GDP on agricultural research. For Zambia, it's 0.3%, so it's extremely low. And this makes it very difficult, this volatility, but also these low levels, for research agencies to attract and keep staff, develop and maintain facilities, and ultimately have sustainable research programs. On the human capacity side, we also identified a number of challenges. And one which was actually a surprise for us slightly is that overall we found that the share of researchers with bachelors have increased. Overall for the 32 countries, slightly from 24% to 27%. But in some of these countries, this increase was particularly high. In Botswana, in Zambia, very high, 20%. In Nigeria, there was a 6% growth in the share of bachelor holders. And this was mostly the result of a large influx of young scientists with bachelor degrees. And this is data for 2007, which shows you the aging, the division of researchers. And this large influx was often the result from a lifting of the recruitment restrictions that were in place for civil service. One example is Ethiopia, where 50% of the researchers were younger than were 30 years or younger. And this is because Ethiopia had invested a lot in increasing its capacity in agricultural research, but a lot is happening at the regional level, at regional research institutes, where a very large share of the agricultural researchers have bachelor's degrees. And actually, Ethiopia is one of the countries which has the lowest shares of master's and PhD holders. And this influx of young scientists is actually straining the capacity of institutions to provide adequate training opportunities and mentoring by senior researchers. A final capacity challenge is, of course, staff turnover. We all know the brain drain, which is also an issue, of course, in agricultural research. But not only lost African agricultural research agencies researchers that moved abroad, but they also lost a large number of researchers to the private sector and in some countries universities, because the latter offer higher paid jobs with better conditions. Another key challenge is also the rapidly aging pool of scientists, many of whom will approach retirement age within the next decade. And this situation is particularly grave in West Africa, but there's also a concern in some of the countries in East and South Africa as well. And to give you some examples, the main agency in Senegal, 59% of the staff was over 50 years. In Niger and Burkina Faso, the average age of a researcher is 50 or higher. So in Kari, in Kenya, more than 1/3 of the staff is over 50 years. And a lot of agencies, the retirement age is 60 years. So in Kenya, they have now increased the retirement age. But still, in 10 years, many of the more senior researchers with higher degrees are leaving the agricultural research system. And many agencies lack middle-level staff to take on the more senior roles of those researchers that have retired, but also have time to mentor the young staff that are coming in with the bachelor degrees that need supervision, and that is an increasing constraint on staff. Taking into account these serious investment and capacity challenges, African governments, donors, and development banks must address the following key areas of policy implications. They need to provide higher and more stable levels of funding by governments to reduce future donor dependency. Governments, together with donors and the development bank, needs to focus on the longer term in order to promote financial stability, institutional efficiency, and overall quality of the research programs. Governments will need to identify long-term national R&D priorities and design relevant programs, and donors need to align their funding towards these national priorities. Second, they need to address the existing and impending challenges in capacity as I just outlined. And this will need also a serious expansion of the investments in agricultural higher education to allow universities to increase the number of PhD and master programs, but also to make improvements in the curricula of their existing programs. And finally, they need to maximize regional and sub-regional cooperation, because many of the small countries in Africa often lack the required critical mass of agricultural capacity and hence face enormous challenges in producing high-quality research outputs. We strongly believe that strong national agricultural R&D programs are crucial for enabling farmers to be more productive and prosperous. Government, donors, and development banks need to provide increased, consistent, and coordinated funding to make this happen. Thank you.